Hello, I'm Nick, and this is Today in Philosophy of History for Thursday, 15 February 2024. It is the 102nd anniversary of the birth of Herman Kahn, who was born in Bayonne, New Jersey on this date in 1922. Herman Kahn was one of the definitive figures of the Cold War. I don't remember where I read this, but in some source, I remember reading that Herman Kahn looked at his book on thermonuclear war as his bid to stand alongside Clausewitz in the canon of military classics. Whether or not he achieved that end, I will not attempt to judge. But when On Thermonuclear War appeared in 1960, it did prove to be something of a sensation. And its impact on post-war America could be compared to the impact of Spengler's The Decline of the West on post-war Germany, even though the wars to which these two books were post were distinct, with Spengler's Decline of the West coming out just as World War I is winding down, and Kahn's On Thermonuclear War coming out 15 years after World War II was already over. But both of these books told their audiences hard truths that are easily evaded, but eventually necessary to consider. So I would say that Spengler and Kahn are the original red pill thinkers, and their thinking took them well outside the bounds of comforting lies. Herman Kahn set himself the task of what he called thinking the unthinkable. This is admirable from a philosophical point of view. Many philosophers would like to think the unthinkable, but they lack either the imagination or the courage to do so. Kahn showed both in thinking about nuclear war. However much we might revile the very idea of nuclear war, it was and remains a definite possibility. Kahn sought to think it through rationally, if not exhaustively, though the terms upon which he thought about nuclear war were quite different from what philosophers were doing at about the same time, and also in response to the events of the Second World War. Yesterday, in my episode on the bombing of Dresden, I mentioned Karl Jaspers and his book, The Future of Mankind, and what Jaspers called the new fact, which was essentially nuclear weapons and their ability to destroy humanity. Another philosopher we could take as an example would be Bertrand Russell, who wrote books on nuclear war, like Common Sense and Nuclear Warfare, who sought to intervene with both Kennedy and Khrushchev during the Cuban Missile Crisis, who protested in the street and was arrested for his trouble. Among academics and the media, it became almost an article of faith that nuclear war is not survivable, and Kahn challenged this. And in doing so, he made enemies. He was skewered in a couple of films, Dr. Strangelove and Failsafe, both of which were released in 1964. The characters in these films that supposedly represent Kahn are the familiar mad scientist Faust and Dr. Frankenstein wrapped up together in one package for the nuclear age, by turns both deluded and crazed by his mental hypertrophy. Scientists, whether those of Goethe or Mary Shelley, or those building atomic weapons out in the desert, are playing God, and the rest of us are going to pay the price. The atomic bomb became the ultimate symbol of this, as the scientist as sorcerer's apprentice, and nuclear war would be the price we would all pay, and that would mean the extinction of humanity and perhaps also the extinction of all life on the planet. That is what Jaspers called the new fact of history. Kahn dealt directly with the charge that even if we could survive nuclear war, the living would envy the dead, so that there would be no point in making any provisions for survival of nuclear war. Kahn begins the book on thermonuclear war by calling attention to what he calls tragic but distinguishable post-war states. There's right in the near the beginning, there's a table 3 provides 7 distinct post-war scenarios ranging from 2 million dead and 1 year to economic recovery, up to 660 million dead and 100 years to economic recovery. In other words, any outcome of a nuclear war would be tragic, but that does not make all possible post-war scenarios the same, nor should we be indifferent to making the distinctions among them. Near the beginning of the book, Kahn writes, quote, "Perhaps the most important item on the table of distinguishable states is not the numbers of dead or the numbers of years it takes for economic recuperation. Rather, it is the question at the bottom, will the survivors envy the dead? It is in some sense true that one may never recuperate from a thermonuclear war. The world may be permanently, i.e. for perhaps 10,000 years, more hostile to human life as a result of such a war. Therefore, if the question, can we restore the post-war conditions of life, is asked, the answer must be no. But there are other relevant questions to be asked. For example, how much more hostile will the environment be? Will it be so hostile that we or our descendants would prefer being dead than alive? Perhaps even more pertinent is this question: how happy or normal a life can the survivors and the descendants hope to have? Despite a widespread belief to the contrary, objective studies indicate that even though the amount of human tragedy would be greatly increased in the post-war world, the increase would not preclude normal and happy lives for the majority of survivors and their descendants," unquote. Today, we would call this a problem of population ethics. And we would be mindful of Derek Parfit's argument that comes at the very end of his book, Reasons and Persons, which pretty much takes Jasper's new fact as its starting point. And I quote from Parfit, "I believe that if we destroy mankind as we now can, this outcome will be much worse than most people think. Compare these three outcomes. 1, peace. 2, a nuclear war that kills 99% of the world's existing population. 3, a nuclear war that kills 100%. 2 would be worse than 1, and 3 would be worse than 2. Which is the greater of these two differences? Most people believe that the greater difference is between 1 and 2. I believe that the difference between 2 and 3 is very much greater. My view is the view of two very different groups of people. Both groups would appeal to the same fact. The Earth will remain inhabitable for at least another billion years. Civilization began only a few thousand years ago. If we do not destroy mankind, these few thousand years may be only a tiny fraction of the whole of civilized human history. The difference between 2 and 3 may thus be the difference between this tiny fraction and all the rest of this history," unquote. What Kahn was saying on thermonuclear war was that he definitely prefers Parfit's scenario 2, where 99% of people die in a nuclear war, to Parfit's scenario 3, which kills 100% of people in a nuclear war. Moreover, Kahn lays out a great many more scenarios than these three. He's famous for his, multiplying scenarios and multiplying the rungs on the ladder of escalation. Furthermore, the quoted passage from Parfit comes at the end of Parfit's book. So Parfit himself does not discuss the immediate outcomes of the scenarios 2 or 3. And I'm sure he would have found it distasteful to do so. But Kahn does this, and he did so in considerable details, and this made a lot of people squeamish. The survivability of nuclear war is a debate that continued long after Kahn had passed out of public consciousness. In 1981, T.K. Jones, a Reagan administration official, had said, quote, "If there are enough shovels to go around, everybody's going to make it," unquote. The reference to shovels was a tool with which you could make an improvised fallout shelter. And if enough people can be gotten into improvised fallout shelters, they can survive a nuclear war. This quote from Jones was used as the title of the book, With Enough Shovels, Reagan, Bush, and Nuclear War, from 1983 by Robert Scheer. Herman Kahn is not mentioned once in this book, though Kahn was still alive, though he died in the same year, 1983. By the 1980s, everyone in the chattering classes had forgotten about Herman Kahn and debate over nuclear war survivability from 20 years before. So they had no qualms about repeating the debate, although doing so in a bowdlerized form so that no one would be aware of the counter-arguments that Kahn had made decades previously. All of the institutions of civil society pretty much unanimously got behind the idea that nuclear war is not survivable, and anyone who failed to get on board could not be expected to get invited to any dinner parties. And this is still the preferred method of using soft power to disrupt and end uncomfortable debates and discussion. To top it off, in 1984, the students of Brown University voted for the university to stock suicide pills because it was better to be dead than to experience life without modern conveniences. The idea of everyone committing suicide in the event of a nuclear war had already been suggested almost 30 years earlier in Neville Shute's 1957 novel. Shute is also not mentioned in the Scheer book. Shute's novel On the Beach was made into the 1959 film with Gregory Peck and Ava Gardner. It's an excellent film, by the way. Also in 1959, Walter M. Miller published A Canticle for Leibowitz. Many people have commented on the theme of cyclical history that is implicit in Miller's book, with a nuclear war and its distant past, and the three sections of the book, which were originally published separately, each set about 600 years apart, recapitulating the fall of an advanced cosmopolitan civilization, the slow rediscovery of science and technology, and the eventual reappearance of a new cosmopolitan civilization, once again destroying itself in a nuclear war. Nuclear apocalypse with only vaguely veiled biblical subtext was one of the great themes of the Cold War, reflecting the extent to which we still see our future in mythological terms. The apocalyptic theme appeared in many different forms in every possible permutation. Miller's version is arguably the most intelligent. It's one of my favorite books, certainly I think the greatest science fiction novel that's ever been written, as well as being the most explicitly biblical. The books of Neville Shute and Robert Scheer are also manifestations of the same underlying anxiety. Herman Kahn was yet another manifestation, but instead of representing a concealed mythology, Kahn represents rationality, specifically the scientific and technological rationality I discussed yesterday in the episode on the bombing of Dresden. Kahn also represents the moral and emotional ambiguity that is the ever-present partner of rational inquiry. Kahn wanted to break us free of the mythological framework for the future and to have us think it through on our own terms. In yesterday's episode, which I've already mentioned a couple times, I mentioned Edith Weischergrod's book, Spirit in Ashes, and her exposition of what she called the death world. Weischergrod doesn't mention Kahn, but I have no doubt, given his affiliation with the defense industry and with his black humor about nuclear war, that she would have seen Kahn as a perfect manifestation of the death world. But in that episode, I suggested against Weischergrod that the death world can serve as a novel way to coordinate scientific and technological rationality, realizing and rationalizing man-made mass death. And certainly, Kahn was dedicated to the rational expression of nuclear war, which would have and still could result in man-made mass death on an unprecedented scale. Kahn did not equivocate on this point. But another aspect of the same rationality is the counter-argument of survivability. Ultimately, Kahn was an optimist, as was revealed in his later writings. In the 1970s, with the Limits to Growth report by the Club of Rome and the advent of the environmental movement as a political force, Kahn wrote a number of futurist forecasts which discussed both the dangers and the opportunities of the future. Again, in a thoroughly rationalistic spirit, strikingly different from those who argue for mass suicide like the students of Brown University. If anything, Kahn was too much of an optimist. In a 1977 report on space development for NASA, which he co-authored, he formulated an optimistic scenario, a moderate scenario, and a pessimistic scenario for space development. And the pessimistic scenario is closest to what has actually happened in space since 1977. As part of their pessimistic scenario, the authors mention a fictitious nuclear accident in 1987 near Los Angeles as souring the public on technology. Instead, we had a nuclear accident in 1986 in Chernobyl. So some of their pessimistic and anti-technology scenario has already happened. The authors wrote, quote, "The potential rewards of space development and space travel had been debated by the new class and found wanting. Indeed, had been judged to be too costly and relatively risky, especially where it involved manned programs. Moreover, there appeared more and more philosophical, religious polemics that asserted that man's attempt to scatter his seeds even further into space was an incipient new form of pollution, if not desecration, of the purity and beauty of the universe," unquote. This is pretty much where we're at today with books like Dark Skies and any number of other books that have come out arguing against space development. So while the worst of Kahn's scenarios have not materialized, and we have not had a nuclear war, even a small one, another part of this pessimistic scenario was a small nuclear war between India and Pakistan, which we came very close to in the 90s, and they did predict it for 95, so that's pretty good. But just as the worst scenarios of Herman Kahn did not materialize, the best scenarios have also not materialized. We have foregone both existential risk and existential hope for the middle path of safety and mediocrity. Kahn's most important legacy, in my judgment, has been his rational engagement with the future. Scenario planning has become so routine that we no longer appreciate how novel it is. Most of human history had only a mythological conception of the future. Kahn applied human reason to the future, and we have been doing so ever since. Many of his predictions didn't pan out. Japan never became the superstate that he predicted in one of his books. But that's beside the point. The point is critically thinking through future possibilities. The expansion of historical consciousness to the future is part of a larger historical process of the expansion of human historical consciousness. Today, we are all familiar with the idea that we are situated in an enormous expanse of time, extending both into the past and deep into the future. There was already what I would call a formal awareness of this in antiquity, which we can find in Lucretius on the Nature of Things near the end of Book 3, where the eternal past is shown to mirror the eternal future. Quote, "Look back at the eternity that passed before we were born and mark how utterly it counts to us as nothing. This is a mirror that nature holds up to us, in which we may see the time that shall be after we are dead," unquote. That's a prose translation. There's an older translation by William Elroy Leonard that is more poetic. "Look back. Nothing to us was all foretold. Nothing to us was all forepast, eld of time the eternal, ere we had a birth. And nature holds this like a mirror up of time to be when we are dead and gone." It was ultimately the work of many centuries to flesh out this idea that time extends long before and long after us. It wasn't until the 19th century that the work of Charles Lyell and Charles Darwin gave us deep time that made palpable geology and biology. It wasn't until the 20th century that the earth sciences, with the maturation of geology into geomorphology and plate tectonics, fully converged on the consequences of our planet having a natural history. And it was in the 20th century that technology advanced to the point that we could formulate a scientific cosmology based on observations reaching the limits of the observable universe, which is older than us by far and will far outlast us. It's still a challenge for us to grasp this, to make it feel real. But planning for the far future is now familiar. It is a central tenet of the environmental movement that human beings can actively intervene in the historical process, choosing among distinguishable future states. Herman Kahn contributed to our attempts to grasp the future in a rational way, to make it a part of human life through the practical means of planning for the future, and to so expand historical consciousness to become historical agency. So happy birthday to Herman Kahn. If you're interested in getting more deeply into Kahn, I recommend the book, The Worlds of Herman Kahn, The Intuitive Science of Nuclear War. It's very deeply researched, and the author did a lot of archival work and a lot of interviews. And of course, his classic on thermonuclear war is It's dated insofar as it discusses a lot of already archaic technologies that were cutting edge technologies at the time. But because it's so explicit throughout, it gives a real sense of Kahn's thinking. So thanks for listening and take it easy.